Hey there, it's Wednesday, and that means it's time for another Ask Me Anything session where I'm answering all your questions about the book publishing industry and how to write a stronger story. I think I saw a comment saying we should call them AAA sessions, Ask Alyssa Anything. I like that. Might have to start using that. Before we get going, let's get the housekeeping out of the way. If you haven't subscribed already and you're watching this, please hit that subscribe button so I can keep growing this amazing community. Also, go ahead and hit that like button while you're at it for the YouTube algorithm, and grab my free story self-assessment in the description below. That is a resource I designed for my YouTube viewers that helps you pinpoint the strengths and weaknesses in your current work in progress. The best part is it's going to sign you up for my newsletter where I give exclusive insights and tips not available anywhere on my channel. So make sure you don't miss out on that. We have some great questions today, so let's dive right in. First question here. Hi Alyssa, I have a question about queries during the Great Resignation. It seems quite possible that no one reads the incoming query letters, at least not for some time. If there is a big reshuffle going on, if temps step in, reduce the workload, or when someone is about to leave and has other things on his or her mind. How do I know my query actually ends up at the right desk? Perhaps it's better to wait a while? The state of querying right now frankly sucks. I'm not gonna sugarcoat it. I made a whole other video about it, so I'll make sure to put that in the description for you to check out if you haven't already. But at the end of the day, if you are following the agent's submission guidelines and you are using the correct form or the email address for your query, I think at this point you just need to let it play out. Yes, it's possible that agents are getting other people to help them with the inflow of submissions because they are overloaded, but that has actually always been the case. In fact, in many cases, agents hire interns specifically to go through their query inboxes. Or if a literary agent has a designated assistant, it is often the assistant's job to do the first pass of query letter reviews. That was what my role was when I worked at a literary agency, and that was long before what we're calling the Great Resignation. From what I'm seeing from agents on Twitter, they are still going through their queries as fast as they can. So if the agent says that they're open to submissions, then feel free to submit to them and trust that they will eventually get back to you according to their guidelines. Remember that sometimes agents, unfortunately, are not going to send you a response and tell you that within a certain month time frame, you should consider it a pass. But frankly, the Great Resignation, agents' workload are things that are out of your control. What you can control is crafting the strongest query possible and making sure that you are submitting it according to the agent's guidelines. So do that and then let the rest play out. The reason I don't necessarily advise to wait if you are ready to query now is because there's no guarantee that anything is going to change. And as I mentioned, agents have pretty much always been overloaded with more queries than they are able to get to in a timely manner. So sitting around and waiting for the industry to shift in a way that is going to help them get through queries faster is not necessarily realistic. So go ahead and send out those queries. Here's another question. I've been on sub with my agent for years. We've been working on different manuscripts, but so far nothing. I'm really starting to get discouraged. Do you have any advice on how to survive editors' rejections and silences? This is a really tough position to be in, because oftentimes we think that getting a literary agent is the golden ticket to publication, right? Because the literary agent believes in your book, then they're going to find the perfect editor and you're gonna get a book deal and everything's going to be amazing. But that's sometimes not what actually ends up happening. And we also need to talk about the struggles of authors who are what we call on submission, where agents are currently in the process of pitching their manuscripts to editors at publishing houses. So in your case, I would definitely encourage you to have a very frank and open conversation with your agent about your concerns if you haven't already. Have you gotten specific feedback from the editors who rejected your manuscripts? What was that feedback like? Can you apply it to your future book projects, or can you apply it to the book that they rejected and see if maybe you could resubmit it? What does your agent think is the roadblock? Is it that you're writing in a genre that isn't quite resonating right now? Or is it a concern with your writing or storytelling? Remember that your agent is your publishing partner, and also remember that this is a business relationship at the end of the day. And if you're not getting what you need to out of that business relationship, it could also be time for you to end that relationship and find another agent. This is an unfortunate position to be in, but I have seen more and more authors opening up about their experiences of ending their relationship with their agent and finding a new one. If this agent isn't able to represent your book in the way that you need them to, if they don't have connections with the editors at publishing houses who actually do want to publish your book, maybe it's a case that there's a mismatch there, where the agent doesn't have the network for the specific type of story that you're trying to publish. In those cases, it is worth considering if another agent might be a better match, and remember that you are well within your rights as an author to find another agent. It's a really tough decision to make, so I really do empathize with you, but start with a frank conversation with your agent about your concerns and just be honest with them. I really hope it works out for you, whether with this agent or a future agent. Here's another question. I have a question about genre. I should by now understand, yet struggle with what genre my novel best fits. It is literary writing, women's fiction, and it has contemporary romance at its core. So when querying, what genre do I identify it as? Not to mention finding the best agent to query. I sometimes feel it is all three, other times I think it is romance, but when I read just romance, it is definitely not just typical romance. Help. Identifying the genre of your book can be one of the most challenging parts of embarking on the querying process. And like many authors, you are in the position of feeling like your book falls into multiple genres, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It means you're blending different genre elements and potentially can reach a wider range of readers for that reason. But for the purposes of querying, it will be important for you to identify what the overarching or the most dominant genre is. You mentioned literary fiction, women's fiction, and romance specifically. So let's dive into kind of the core elements of each of those genres, and then hopefully that'll help you identify which one it falls under. Literary fiction is probably the toughest genre to define, but typically in the publishing industry, it is used to describe stories where the craft of writing is prioritized above other storytelling elements. So the style of the prose, the language is very evocative and very distinct. Oftentimes, literary fiction novels have less of a definable hook, like a novel that is more plot-driven would have. When it comes to women's fiction, this encompasses a broad range of stories, everything from beach reads, rom-coms, to family sagas that center on female characters. The idea with women's fiction is typically that it has a female-centered journey at its core. And you'll also see the term upmarket women's fiction used to identify stories that are appealing to a female readership, that are highlighting a female story or a female voice, but do have an elevated quality of writing reminiscent of literary fiction. And then finally, romance is typically considered what we call a more commercial genre, where it is more focused on the romance plot specifically. If you're going to label a book romance, then the romance is really going to be the center of the story. It's going to be the main focus. So you mentioned having read romance books and it doesn't really seem like what you are writing. So in that case, I would encourage you to think more about women's fiction, literary fiction, and figuring out where your story fits within those two genres. Remember that when we're talking about literary versus commercial versus upmarket, it's a spectrum really, and I go into this in a whole other video, so I'll leave the link in the description as another resource for you. Here's the last question today. I have a question about writing rather than publishing. I am happy with the plot I've come up with, but I'm struggling a lot with creating compelling characters. What advice and methods would you recommend to craft engaging people to populate the story? How do you know when you've made enough? So I'm going to provide my biggest piece of advice with writing compelling characters, which is to make sure that they are multi-dimensional. Characters often fall flat when they are in the story just for a specific function and to serve a specific role, and we really get no sense of who they are outside of the story. What drives them? What motivates them? What is their backstory? What are their concerns and their desires? I often work with writers on refining and articulating each character's motivation and objective and where that comes from. So I really recommend doing that work behind the scenes as you begin to develop and craft your characters. That is going to be what ensures that these characters are layered and therefore that they feel like real, authentic people, and that the reader can then invest in them emotionally and connect with them. Surface level characters ultimately just end up feeling superficial and more like game pieces that are just being used to advance the plot rather than fleshed out, highly complex personas in their own right. Many readers, myself included, are quite character-oriented over plot-oriented, so I would recommend prioritizing your character development, and I will leave a link in the description for my tips on crafting authentic characters. That's all we had time for today. If you have any questions, make sure to leave them in the comments here. This is the queue I use when I go through and answer questions. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already, and that free story self-assessment is waiting for you in the description below. Thanks so much for watching and happy writing.